Good. Hi there. So this is Ewan.
Yes.
And why don't you tell me a little bit about why you've come to see me about Ewan's tongue tie, what you're experiencing, and how you think I can help you.
So, when Ewan was born, the first day he wasn't feeding particularly well. We had support from Andy, the breastfeeding midwife, and she identified he had a tongue tie. We managed to get him feeding on day 2, and feeding ongoing has been okay.
Right.
It can be quite painful sometimes. He often slips off, and then he'll kind of almost nipple feed for a bit and then get himself back on again, so it can be quite uncomfortable.
So it's still uncomfortable for you even 2 months down the track?
Not every feed, but certainly a number of feeds that he does per day. Often hear quite a bit of clicking noise, and that links into when he's not on or doesn't stay on particularly well.
Okay.
He's recently been diagnosed with reflux, and it was suggested at that point that
Sometimes they air swallow a bit
yeah.
as well. Is he on treatment for that?
Yes, he started omeprazole 2 weeks ago.
Who started that?
That was paediatricians up at Southampton General on PAU.
Okay. Is he on any other medicines?
No.
And is he's a healthy little person?
Yes.
Okay. Any bleeding or bruising problems from his point of view in the family history?
No.
And his baby check was fine?
Yes.
And you're managing to get him to grow?
Yeah,
Is he
he's
just
growing beautifully.
exclusively breastfed?
Yeah,
or
exclusively
so
breastfed.
it's simply the process of feeding is still not
he
right?
gets a lot of hiccups.
Okay.
Like, over half his feeds every day he will have hiccups. A lot of back arching, screaming.
Okay.
Just he's very. He can bring up his wind okay, but he appears to be quite windy.
Okay. Is he pooing okay?
Yeah, I think his stools are a little bit looser since being on the
Okay.
omeprazole.
And what have you been told about tongue tie, or how we might be able to help you?
I think I was expecting an assessment today, obviously, and then I'm aware that you can snip them if you feel that it's necessary.
Okay.
I think it's just been mentioned by paediatricians in Southampton, things like that it was worth coming just to have a good assessment, if that's
good.
okay.
All right then. Come on then, little dude. You come and talk to me. Hello. What do you think? When did he last feed?
It was literally just before 1.
Right.
So it took him just past 1, if that makes sense, but it was before.
Okay. So it's got a normal palate, as far as I can tell. Yeah, good. I'm sorry. And then when we look underneath his tongue, Mum, if you just tuck in there, there's a very, very small bridge of skin there. Can you see?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
So that's a tiny, tiny little bridge of skin there. Okay. What do you think? Have you seen him being able to stick his tongue out past his lower lip?
Yes, I would say it's probably just slightly further past his lower lip. He seems to have almost like it's quite unusual when he kind of, there's a bit of a curve and a wave in it, if that makes sense.
Right. What, when he's actually
describe
moving it moves in a funny way? Or
Yeah, and then, so sometimes if he's crying, it curves in and it doesn't, not how my daughter's kind of did, if that makes sense.
Okay.
I don't know how to describe
So,
it.
here's the thing.
Almost curves up at the
Okay.
sides.
So, if you dial back 15 or 20 years ago, so if you go back 20 years ago, we were basically told tongue tie was normal. It wasn't a disease or an illness or a thing. We were just told to reassure parents and say that it was not a big deal and they needed to just, not worry about it. What we know is that tongue tie is not a disease or an illness or a malformation. It's not a thing. and it's a way that about 3 or 4% of normal babies' tongues look to be tongue-tied. So that little flap of skin is a normal thing, and we would never say that you would divide it in the newborn period because you're worried about their ability to talk or snog or lick ice creams or stick their tongue out at the teacher.
Yep.
So this is purely about feeding,
Yep.
and we know that it's really only about breastfeeding. In other words, there is no evidence, nobody's ever shown that it improves bottle feeding or spoon feeding. This is purely about breastfeeding.
Okay.
And the evidence seems to be that if you take a group of breastfeeding babies who are not breastfeeding well in the way that you've described, painful feeding, tending to almost like chomp on the nipple rather than draw from the breast properly, if you take those babies who are slipping off the breast and really struggling to maintain a latch, about 70 or 80% of them will feed better straight away
Okay.
or within the next few days if you
Okay.
divide it.
Okay.
What it means is that there's about 20 or 30% of significantly tongue-tied babies who their breastfeeding problems have got nothing to do with tongue-tie,
Yeah.
and actually about 50% of normal babies with tongue-tie breastfeed normally.
Yeah.
So the point is that most babies with tongue-tie don't need it doing. Those that do need it doing, it's only for breastfeeding, and if you take children with significant tongue-tie, about 7 or 8 out of 10 will do better if you snip it.
Okay.
Yeah? Now, that's for all comers. My data was exactly the same. I know that about 70 or 80% of the babies I did out of the first 100 were feeding better a week later.
Okay.
I have no idea what they were doing 2, 3, 6 months down the track.
Okay.
We think it probably improves overall breastfeeding rates. That's the suggestion, that's what we believe, but nobody's ever proven that definitely. Because basically those of us who care about tongue-tie are going to get crack on and do it if we think it's the right thing to do, and nobody's really done those long-term studies. So the point is, it's important that people understand that we can't say, oh, this will definitely solve all your problems,
Mhm.
because there's no such thing as a free lunch. So it always hurts a little bit,
Mhm.
but in 80% of the babies that I did in my first 100, by the time they got home, the parents said we wouldn't have known anything could be done. So the pain settles down quickly in most babies. The bleeding, it always bleeds a little bit, and the few thousand that Andy and I have done between us, we've each had one baby where we were sort of still leaning on the hole about an hour and a bit later, and those are the worst bleeders that the two of us have had. So generally it bleeds and it settles down and it's very quick and it's not a big deal. I've had one baby that needed intravenous antibiotics for an infection. That's the only infection I'm aware of having. And otherwise, you know, the risks of hitting something serious are so small that they're just not worth talking about. So the key thing really is, in all babies with breastfeeding problems, you've got about a 7 or 8 out of 10 chance of making people's lives better. You've got a small but non-zero chance of significant bleeding, a small but non-zero chance of infection, and basically the major risk is that you're going to do something unnecessary.
Okay.
In terms of what this means for Ewan, he's got a very mild tongue tie. Now
Okay.
the data that I got and that we all got was on the very severe ones, the ones from tip of tongue to tip of gum. It was short, it was tight, you could see they couldn't stick their tongues. You know, those are the ones that I love seeing now because it's so easy. I think for babies like this it is much harder because actually he's very mildly tongue-tied. And it sort of comes down to then a conversation between you and me, where if you're the sort of mum who's going, do you know what, the feeding is a bit tricky, but it's fine, I'd rather not do anything unless you can guarantee you're helping me, then I'm not your man. Whereas if you said, look, this is unbelievably uncomfortable, it's so different to how feeding was before, I think that it's worth a go, I'm very, very relaxed about doing that because it's your baby and your breast and your feeding,
Okay.
and what I want is for you to be able to breastfeed your baby comfortably for as long as you wish to.
Yeah.
And so it kind of comes down to a bit of a grey, what do you think sort of conversation at this
Okay.
point.
Okay.
What are your thoughts?
I mean, one of the main reasons that we came was because of the reflux.
Yeah, yeah,
And we've kind of reached, he is so much better than he was. I mean, 2
Yeah.
weeks ago he
Yeah.
screamed 24
Yeah.
hours a day. It's
Yeah.
horrendous. Still not a point where we can lay him down. So he still is
yeah,
quite refluxy.
yeah, yeah,
And I think that's why it was suggested
yeah.
that at the hospital that it might be worth having this conversation to see
Yeah.
whether...
So I definitely see
That there's a
babies
link.
with nasty reflux where I believe, and this is a belief, not
Yeah,
a
yeah,
fact, but
yeah.
I believe that in the process of trying to stick their tongues out and spread it to feed from the breast, the tongue-tied babies don't do that. They feed very inefficiently, which
Yeah.
is why it's so painful.
Yeah.
But as they're feeding inefficiently, I think they probably take a lot of air down.
Yeah,
So I
agree.
do believe that there are tongue-tied refluxy babies who reflux less if they swallow air less. I do believe that. What that means in terms of numbers or chances of my being able to help you, I honestly don't have a clue, and I don't think there's anybody else who can
No.
give you a better answer.
I think from the main reason I'm here is more I'm kind
Yeah.
of putting up with him slipping off and being
Yeah,
quite uncomfortable
yeah.
from time to time
Yeah,
throughout the day. It's more for the
yeah.
reflux side of things that
Well, on balance, do you think you'd rather we did it or didn't do it, or how would you like to play?
I'd rather give it a go and see whether it has an
I think
improvement,
that's
'cause-
entirely reasonable. I mean,
Yeah.
that's what informed consent is all about,
Yeah.
right? So if you want to crack on and do it today, that's absolutely fine. It's not a problem. Literally, the long bit of this conversation, or the long bit of this process, is the conversation.
Yeah.
The procedure itself takes me about 30 seconds, and sorry, matey, and a 29p pair of disposable scissors. I literally will take him to the room next door, do the deed, and we'll be back for a cuddle and feed.
Yeah.
Well, he gets a cuddle and feed.
Yeah.
obviously. And then we see how we are.
Yeah, I'd like to give it.
Fine. I don't follow the babies up.
Okay.
Generally, if you're going to see problems, you'll see it in the next couple of days in terms of infection. So we give you open access to the ward for the next 2 or 3 days.
Okay.
You'll notice a white sort of diamond-shaped ulcer underneath the tongue,
Okay.
which just takes a few days to heal. There's
Okay.
no evidence that doing sort of stretching exercises or anything makes the blindest bit of difference. You just
Okay.
feed as normally, treat as normal. If you're worried that he's unwell because he's got high fevers, he's not feeding, he starts bleeding again,
Yeah.
then you give us a call. And we see.
Okay. And he's okay to have things like Calpol and things
Yeah.
like that if
He shouldn't need
Yeah.
it, and so I think one of those, like you do for your jabs,
Yeah.
one of
okay.
those I think is fine. If you were
Yeah.
needing it repeatedly, then I'm
Yeah,
thinking,
no, that's
well,
fine. That's
what's
fine.
that
We're
all
not a
about?
big fan of
No,
dosing them
no, I
up
think
unless
that's
they're
right.
needing
Is
to.
that okay?
Yeah, that'd be great.
So should we
And
crack on?
yeah, please.
Okay,
And he'd
all
like
right
to feed
then.
as well, so.
Brilliant.